Rain needles the bridge glass, and the bow lifts into a black hill of water. Somewhere below, the sonar repeater ticks like a metronome counting down the last 10 seconds of a hunt. May 1943. North Atlantic, the night the surface learned to kill in silence, and the watch on a German Type 7 Cheeks, raw with salt, stares into a void that answers him with pings he cannot shake. He has lived through the old rhythm charge and contact, lost a thunder of depth charges behind the wake, and then blessed guesswork. But tonight, the sea withholds its roar. The destroyer slides closer without blinding itself. The wire holds, and the final approach feels wrong in his bones. They fire, and the sea stays quiet. Only when it hits does it speak. Up on the American bridge, the world narrows to numbers and breath. Bearing rate flattening. Range steadying. The captain lifts his hand, and every man around him stops being a person and becomes a part. The talker's syllables clipped to iron. The plotter's pencil biting through wet paper. The gunner's shoulders locked to a new frame bolted to the forecastle. 24 stub-nosed bombs leap forward in a ripple, not dropped astern but thrown ahead, arming as they fall, falling fast. No time fuses. No rolling thunder to announce a miss. Just a ring of small promises disappearing into black. The U-boat's helmsman throws the wheel for the old Salvation, banking hard into the void, where escorts used to go blind. But the pings keep coming, and the silence keeps holding, and that is when the math turns from comfort to terror. The weapon has no pride in noise. It rejects applause. If the water stays mute, you live to guess again. If it speaks once, and the sound comes up through the keel like a verdict. Ahead, on the destroyer's bow, a lookout blinks salt from his lashes, seeing nothing but the seam where sky meets sea. He hears it before he feels it. A single thick thump, no grand finale, no cymbal crash, just a sentence ending with a period. The officer of the deck does not cheer. He only marks the time and the bearing, because this is how the ocean keeps score, now not with area but with contact. Not with thunder, but with precision. Not where the submarine was, but where it will be in the next breath. The problem began as a geometry lesson taught by bad weather. Convoys were arithmetic stretched across a hostile ocean, 40 to 60 merchantmen in 2 or 3 columns, lumbering at 8 to 10 knots, escorted by a screen that could sprint to 28 knots, only to throw itself blind into the last 100 seconds of an attack. The submarine's calculus was leaner. A Type 7 could submerge in roughly half a minute to periscope depth, turn inside its own wake, and let the escort overshoot. Depth charges answered with mass, and timing heavy steel cans rolled from rails or kicked from K-guns fused to explode at guessed depths after counted seconds. They were thunder writ large, and they made the sea ring, but they imposed attacks no physics could forgive. The moment the escort committed sonar contact, died under the ship's own wake and shock. The last view of the target vanished precisely when certainty mattered most. On American bridges, the first arguments for a forward throw were not poetic. They were made in bearing rates and stopwatch clicks. Keep the wire singing. Stop rewarding the submarine for the instant you must lose it. A destroyer that could fire ahead could hold the curve of approach intact, aim where the target would be, and sever the ritual of blind overrun. The first concrete number that changed conversations was modest and devastating. A pattern projected roughly 200 to 270 yards forward gave an escort about 8 to 10 seconds of extra tracked time at attack speed to place steel over the true vector. 8 seconds in a knife fight is not a sliver. It is a room. The submarine's planners read the same sea with different eyes. They husbanded endurance diesel fuel in tons, battery hours counted like coins, and trusted in invisibility layered with probability. Submerged, a U-boat crawled at 3 to 4 knots for silence. Fast underwater, it could touch 7, maybe 8 for only minutes, before the battery curve punished it. The safest place during an escort run-in had always been that small pocket of water, just under the attacker's bow. A momentary sanctuary born of acoustics and blast. Hedgehog erased the sanctuary with something almost impolite, small charges that bit on contact rather than shout on schedule. The weapon's character did not announce itself. It simply removed the one favor the ocean had extended to boats for years. On a night watch in the mid-Atlantic, The escort officer's world narrowed to a plot range creeping down in stair steps, bearing rate flattening, as the approach steadied Doppler shift sliding toward zero. He could feel the temptation to dump charges early, to demand the comfort of noise, but the new frame on the forecastle promised a cleaner endgame if he held his nerve. 24 stub-nosed projectiles weighted in a ring, each about 7.2 inches across, and roughly 65 pounds in the hand, a third of that weight an explosive that preferred to pierce rather than shove. Fired in a ripple, they arced forward and fell fast on the order of 22 to 25 feet each second, arming as they went, angling into a circle the size of a small city intersection. In the old playbook, a miss filled the ocean with drama. In the new one, silence meant try again immediately with your hearing intact. Then they realized the quiet itself was a teacher. Crews learned faster because there was no applause for failure. A run ended either with a single thick impact felt through boots and knee joints, or with nothing at all. Both outcomes drove the same discipline. Keep tracking. Reset bearings. Fire again, without ceremony. The talker's cadence changed aboard ships that embraced the logic. Orders shortened, pauses lengthened, patience replaced flourish. The escort's sprint turned into a metered walk that refused to outrun its own information. Across the periscope rim, the change felt like theft. A Kapitän Lieutenant riding the scope at dawn once counted on the escort's roar to mask his break. Now the roar did not come. Instead, the pings stayed crisp through the last seconds, and the hull shuddered not from a rolling wall of pressure, but from a single hammer blow at an angle he could not quite predict. He could alter depth by a few meters in that span, throw the helm or blow a wisp of oil and decoys, but the opponent above had traded spectacle for closure. The loss of the blind moment meant the best evasive habit turn when they must guess no longer mapped to the physics of the engagement. The stakes were not abstract. In 1942, the mid-ocean gap had been an open wound, a quadrant where air and escort could not stitch visits together. By mid-1943, the lattice of coverage hardened and every additional minute converted. Forward throw, married to better sensors and better plotting, turned minutes into kills. A convoy master felt it in the way a night passed fewer sudden flares astern, fewer panicked zigzags, while an escort group commander measured it in cleaner logs and fuel saved when re-attacks no longer bloomed into long wasteful patterns. The Allied problem had always been throughput tons per day, arriving rather than promised, and any device that compressed the time between contact and result paid into that account with compound interest. Doctrine followed hardware, but not instantly. The first crews to carry the new frames treated them like a curiosity bolted to tradition. They still dropped charges to convince themselves they were fighting. Instructors began to strip that reflex out. The mantra settled into 3 short imperatives: keep contact, fire forward, let silence be a verdict. Shore parties added another drill re-attack, as if the first pattern never happened. The escort that could reset within a minute, hold the thread, and fire a second ring without raising its voice became something submariners whispered about, with a mix of disbelief and respect. The ship had not grown teeth so much as it had learned to use its ears while biting. By the end of that first season, the shape of a typical approach had changed enough that even old hands felt the difference in their bones. There was still rain, still black water, and cold knuckles and graphite ground into the grain of wooden plotting boards. But the last 10 seconds no longer belonged to luck or to the romantic hope that thunder would make truth. They belonged to a device that carried a simple promise on each of 24 iron noses: if the ocean speaks, it will be because steel has touched steel. And if it does not, the only answer is another measured breath, another forward throw, and the refusal to surrender the one gift the new geometry gives those 8 extra seconds in which a hunter remains fully awake. Steel solves what courage cannot. The frame that sailors casually called a hedgehog was really a geometry machine. 2 arced racks of spigots set on the forecastle angled so that 24 stub-nosed bombs left the bow in a ripple and stitched an oval of water that overlapped the submarine's projected path. Each projectile rode a simple, brutal logic, a hollow tail, to accept the spigot's impulse, a short body 7.2 inches across thick-walled to bite instead of blossom, and a contact fuse that refused to speak unless it met steel. Fired together, they made a promise a depth charge never could, that silence meant miss, not maybe. What mattered first was not explosive weight, but kinematics. A destroyer at attack speed had only seconds to convert bearing rate into a place in the future. The old endgame asked too much at once overrun the datum lose sonar and turbulence hope. A timed blast bracketed the target's new depth. The forward throw broke that chain. By pushing the pattern roughly 200 yards ahead, the ship kept the wire alive through the run-watched Doppler bleed toward zero and pressed the trigger without surrendering perception. The bombs fell fast, measured by crewmen in heartbeats more than feet per second, and the pattern they drew was tight by design, a small city circle rather than a county. The weapon traded volume for certainty and made the last 10 seconds a matter of aim instead of ritual. Under the weathered paint, the engineering was spare. The mount needed no turret ring or recoil beds. Each bomb used the spigot itself as a barrel, the propellant trapped in the tail tube and consumed at ignition. That meant negligible kick to the ship and near zero disruption to the bow's trim. It also meant a reload cycle that fit the rhythm of a re-attack, 2 lines of men moving like a drill team, hands on cold steel, passing squat rounds from ready racks to sockets until the ring was alive again. On practiced crews, the interval between patterns shrank to a minute or less, not because they hurried, but because the device asked so little to go again. The fuse was the weapon's soul. It did not bargain with time or pressure. It demanded contact. In tank trials ashore, ordnance men sank test bodies against plates rolled to submarine hull thickness and learned what the sea would teach at scale. A small charge placed directly does a cleaner kind of violence than a big one placed vaguely. Shock that wraps a hull can rattle teeth and instruments. A bite that pierces frames ends arguments. The notes from those trials are almost bloodless in tone, entry hole, petaled edges, internal spall, but the effect at sea, translated to 2 words every sonar man learned to recognize in the log's breakup noises. Adversary eyes saw the truth from the wrong end of the periscope. The pocket of safety under an attacking bow had once been a fact of life, a blind cone carved by acoustics and timing. Now that pocket was where the pattern lived. A Kapitän Lieutenant who had trained to jink into silence found himself jinking into a net, and the first hint that the old habit had turned treacherous was not a roar behind him, but the absence of one. The escort above did not fill the ocean with drama to mask its own doubt. It withheld sound until it had certainty, and then spoke once in a low, physical word that men felt through decks and bones. Sensors made the design more than a trick. The ahead throw made sense only if the ship could see while it struck, and the newer sets answered that requirement at knife ranges where earlier gear smeared. Operators learned to nurse the last 100 yards, as if tuning a stringed instrument, easing speed to keep reverberation manageable, letting the bearing steady until the Doppler settled into a near-flat hum. The helmsman's hands changed 2 little corrections instead of grand ones, a patience that looked like nerve but was really discipline learned from the weapon's feedback. Silence, adjust, and go again. Thump, mark, and move. On a rain-polished key behind a shed door, a captured hull section told the same story in metal. Engineers from a trials unit coated its interior with whitewash, set it opposite a test tank, and fired inert bodies to watch how the plates deformed before live tests began. The chalk starred and flaked in tidy constellations. On live runs, the constellations became holes with clean lips and a rash of spall marks that looked from a distance like frost. One officer traced a ring of fragments with a pencil and wrote a line in the margin that crews at sea would have translated more simply, "This is not a blast weapon. This is a finding weapon." Logistics kept pace because the device was thrifty. Projectiles were compact enough to stack in numbers on small decks. Propellant tails were safer to handle than fat fused cans, and the mount's maintenance burden sat closer to carpentry than to turretry. The gain showed up not only in kill reports, but in the negative space of operations, fewer minutes lost to elaborate patterns, fewer barrels wasted to prove intent, fewer sensors deafened by friendly thunder. A ship that once performed for the ocean now conversed with it. Then they realized the numbers were teaching doctrine. Crews who lived with the ring on their bows stopped asking for luck. The approach grew quiet, almost meditative, and the moment of decision became small enough to fit in a captain's lifted hand. Bearing steady. Range right. Fire. Wait for the only answer that matters. Fire again if none comes. The machine on the forecastle was not elegant to look at, but it made an elegant demand on men believe what you can still hear. They tried it first in weather that punished hesitation. A Castle-class corvette shouldered into a North Atlantic squall, her bow vanishing and reappearing in curtains of spray, while the sonar plot built the nervous little staircase that meant a target holding course and depth. The captain let the range creep inside 2 cables, steadied the bearing with a nudge to port, and refused the easy comfort of thunder. The forward frame spoke in a dry ripple, no drama, and the sea answered by keeping its counsel. Nothing. Silence as a verdict. Silence as a lesson. He marked the time marked. The bearing walked the ship back onto the curve and fired again. This time the deck took a single heavy note up through everyone's boots. Oil reached the surface 12 minutes later, wrinkling the gray water into a bruise. They had not overwhelmed the ocean. They had persuaded it. The next incident came with daylight and aircraft in the picture, a Bay of Biscay patrol that cornered a boat forced down by a lee light the night before. The destroyer kept a civil tempo, the bridge talker's cadence unhurried, as the bearing froze in that thin, thrilling way operators called glued. Sailors new to the system expected spectacle. Veterans of a few runs already knew the new ritual's austerity ripple. Wait, listen. The bow shook, then nothing. The captain's hand stayed down. He wanted the thread unbroken, preferred another forward cast to a backward storm. The boat below tried the old salvation, a hard turn, just under the attacker's nose. It broke instead into the ring the ship had thrown for exactly that instinct. Captured truth usually arrives with grease under the fingernails. In a dockyard shed, a trial team laid out a section of submarine hull rolled plate on a frame opposite a test tank, and began a day's work of finding out why a small charge could write a final sentence so cleanly. Inert bodies chalked and numbered went first to tune angles and standoffs, then live rounds with contact pistols. The steel recorded each conversation with the precision of a stenographer entry hole, with pedaled edges, interior spall, and starburst's frame distortion measured in fractions of an inch. What mattered to ships at sea was simpler. Contact fuses divorced the kill from the calendar. Results were not scheduled. They were earned at the point of touch. Word bled across the other side unevenly, from rumor to briefing to doctrine. A U-boat flotilla staff officer annotated patrol reports with a nervous new symbol whenever an attack carried the terse phrase "no detonation heard." It meant the escorts were shooting, and the ocean wasn't applauding. In wardrooms, the older hands started warning the younger ones that the last blind patch under an oncoming bow, the bit of water that had saved them since training, had become treacherous. A few crews, after riding out forward, throws that missed, risked a peek through the periscope to confirm their luck. The pings were still there. That was the horror of it. The pursuer had not outrun its own ears. The Pacific wrote its own chapter in a tighter hand. A small task group fell on a line of Japanese submarines reported by traffic analysis, and the work turned almost clerical. Contact approach, ripple thump oil, then again and again. The destroyer escort that would end the month as a line in every anti-submarine manual did not look like a killer. She looked thrifty, thin-hulled, trim, the forward frame bolted like a practical afterthought. The men aboard learned to keep their breathing measured as the last 10 seconds stretched. They learned to trust the wire over nerves. They learned to accept the silence of a miss without filling it with noise that would deafen the follow-up. When the tally closed, even their admirals wrote in the restrained tone of bookkeepers confronted with an impossible column that still adds up. On another ocean margin, an American East Coast hunt plated the pattern into local memory. A merchantman went down near Rhode Island, the datum fixed by smoke and men in the water. What followed was not fury so much as process, surface ships and aircraft braided passes, charges where appropriate forward throws when plots were clean, and patient reattacks that refused to grow sloppy under the pressure to be seen doing something. Divers would later bring back photographs and stories, but on the day itself, the only story that mattered fit in the span between 2 pings and a single physical answer that came up through a destroyer's keel like a judge's gavel. Back on the training ranges, the device matured in human hands. Reload teams shaved seconds without drama. Operators learned that a touch on speed, one knot less here, a throttle breath there, kept reverberation on from smearing the final red. Gunnery officers discovered that pattern discipline mattered an oval when the target's vector was sure, a circle when uncertainty was honest. No one called that art. They called it checklists. And because misses made no noise, crews were spared the noisy lies that used to creep into logs as probable or possible. An approach ended with proof or with nothing. Either outcome taught. Then they realized the captured lessons cut both ways. When Allied examiners walked the decks of surrendered boats at war's end, they found notes and margins in German hand that mapped to the same geometry, turn early alter depth before attackers' steady decoys late useless. The enemy had identified the few thin grains of chance left at the end of a run and named them correctly, which is a kind of respect. But across oceans and months, respect did not change arithmetic. The escorts had seized the last 10 seconds and refused to give them back. A final vignette belongs at human height. On a winter midwatch, a young sonar man takes off one headset, rubs the line it has carved into his hair, and drinks something that has long since gone cold. His plotter's pencil is a stub. The bridge asks him for one more bearing, and he sings it out, steady and quiet. Forward men are setting squat rounds into their sockets with the awkward tenderness of tired strength mittens against raw steel. The captain is saying very little because very little is required now that they have a tool which will not flatter them for guessing. The ship breathes, the ocean answers in pings, and somewhere ahead of the bow, a space the size of a small intersection becomes the only place that matters in the world. Doctrine made the device honest. Ships that killed consistently were not the ones with the newest paint or the proudest captains. They were the ones that synchronized hearing movement and restraint until the forward throw felt less like a trick and more like a language. Reliability was the grammar. Crews learned to keep moisture out of connectors with rituals as simple as canvas covers and as particular as wiping a spigot's face with alcohol-dampened cloth before a cold dawn shot. The mount's simplicity paid dividends, a frame of steel impulse tails that did not mind salt so long as gaskets were respected, fuses that asked only to be dry and correctly safetied. Gunsmiths with file and lamp-black fitted lugs until each projectile seated with a satisfying, repeatable bite. The cost in man-hours was low. The gain was a weapon that behaved the same on the 23rd re-attack as it had on the first. The unseen architecture ashore mattered just as much. Training pipelines stopped treating anti-submarine warfare as an improvisation and started teaching it as a timed drill. On the sonar school's floor, operators learned to fight the ocean's lies, surface ducting, that lifted echoes, layer changes, that bent pings, wrecks that looked alive. In the attack, trainers' bridge teams rehearsed the endgame until the pause between a steady bearing call and a captain's standby fire became muscle memory. Then they realized the greatest luxury the forward throw offered was not power but time, 8 or 10 extra seconds of confirmed geometry in which the ship could act without the old panic. In those seconds, checklists replaced superstition. Speed nudged down just enough to tame reverberation. Helm inputs shrank to half degrees. The plotter's pencil skated unhurried across waxed paper. Radios and plotting turned single ship skill into group advantage. On a good night, the ether carried calm voices, an HF-DF fix that bent a convoy 10 miles clear of a pack. An aircraft call that drove a boat down early. An escort carrier's controller sliding chess pieces with a quiet, "You hold contact." Baker, prepare to fire. Voice discipline was part courtesy, part weapon. The group commander's real leverage came from refusing to let multiple ships talk themselves into confusion at the last minute. One ship fired. One ship prepared to take the thread if the sea stayed mute. One ship orbited on a leash never so close that her own wake would smother a friend's sonar. The forward throw thrived in that silence. It rewarded the fleet that could keep its own noise floor low. Fuel and fatigue drew their own lines on the chart. Escorts could sprint, but every knot beyond the sweet spot paid interest across the next 3 watches. The weapon itself asked for calm hands rather than burning boilers. Captains who learned to walk into the last 200 yards instead of lunging found they ended the night with fuel to spare and sensors still crisp. Stokers noticed. Yeomen noticed when the engineering log's fuel curve smoothed. And the convoy commodore, eyes burning from salt and sleeplessness, noticed most when mornings arrived with more ships than the odds had promised. On the other side of the periscope, counters were real but narrow. A careful boat could complicate the approach with a shallow, early turn before the escort's bearing steadied, forcing the attacker to choose between a premature shot or a longer, riskier endgame. A thermal layer at the wrong depth could throw a false kindness across the plot, making the contact seem farther or closer than it was. Decoys thrown late were theater. Thrown early, they might steal the escort's eye for a handful of heartbeats. But the discipline above water soured most counters. When the ship refused to roar just to feel brave, when it conserved hearing and believed its wire, those heartbeats shrank until the only faithful move left to a hunted submarine was not to be there at all. Failures taught as cleanly as successes. A wet fuse after green water washed the bow. The logs recorded the miss without euphemism, and the bosun's party adjusted covers and tie-downs before the next run. A pattern too wide because the helmsman chased a nervous bearing swing. The drill the next afternoon turned on the wheelhouse voice that said, "Hands off for the last 50 yards." A sonar team that let reverberations smear the final read. They learned to bleed speed a knot earlier, accepting the small risk of giving the target a breath in exchange for the larger promise of clarity. The forward throw was forgiving. In one sense, silence did not punish with self-deafening blast. It was ruthless in another. Silence gave you no alibi. Either you found the hull or you hadn't. Act accordingly. There is a remembered patrol where these pieces clicked into a kind of grace. Night, low cloud, the sea like hammered lead. A single contact skating along the convoy's quarter, slow-bearing drift, no radar cross-section to speak of. The screen commander passed assignments in 10 words, then said nothing more. The attacking destroyer eased to the speed her operators liked for the last 100 yards, let the bearing flatten, and fired. Nothing. A quiet minute. Fired again. One deep thump. No cheers. The second ship rolled in, ready to take the thread if needed, and found there was no thread left to take. The bridge logged the time and the place. The Commodore slept an hour he had not expected to sleep. Then they realized what the weapon had done to their culture. It had made patience into a tactic, and proof into an ethic. The roar had once been reassurance. Now reassurance lived in a single felt note and an oil slick that did not lie. Men went off watch less wrung out, because they were no longer fighting their own procedures. The ocean remained hostile and arbitrary, but the last 10 seconds, those most human of spans, were finally engineered. And in that narrow engineered space, escorts stopped performing for the sea and started speaking with it, one measured pattern at a time. They did not admit it at first. Sailors rarely do. The logs stayed dry, the signals stayed clipped, and even the after-action reports clung to euphemisms that kept fear at bay. But the curve was bending, and everyone who lived on it could feel the tilt. The escorts were no longer bleeding minutes into guesswork. Those minutes had been engineered out of the last 10 seconds, and the sea began returning binary answers with a regularity that offended superstition. The moment of recognition did not come with a trumpet. It arrived as arithmetic. In a single spring, boats that once ghosted through the convoy screen began to vanish at a rate that could not be paid for very long. Men who had ridden out walls of depth-charged thunder discovered that one quiet run followed by a single heavy note through the hull was the new grammar of failure. Then they realized what the hard number meant. Exchange rates had been inverted. Where a barrage once demanded dozens of attacks to yield a single wreck, the forward throw turned clean tracks into conversions in a handful of runs. Commanders who prided themselves on patience started to see patience used against them. An escort that refused to shout, refused to outrun its own ears, refused to surrender the thread, and the old evasive reflex under the bow cone became a deathward turn into an oval of falling steel. In headquarters, the shape of orders changed. Boats were shifted away from the lanes where escorts and aircraft had made a lattice. Patrol lines were set farther out, closer to thin returns and longer odds. The phrase unsustainable crept into briefings that had once been all elan and anecdote. A Kapitän-Leutnant felt the truth long before the charts caught up. One night in the North Atlantic, the sea running black and mean, he worked the periscope sparingly, and listened for the stage cue that always gave him a beat to act the overrun and the roar. It never arrived. The pings thinned but did not vanish. The bearing steadied in a way that told him everything he needed to fear. He had taught his helmsman to turn at that moment and dive into the attacker's blind pocket. The helm went over. The boat slid precisely into the place where salvation used to live. The forward ring met him there. The first thump was not loud. It was intimate. In the Pacific, realization took the form of a ledger that looked like a typist's error. A small destroyer escort worked a line of submarines with a method that bordered on asceticism. Contact held speed, trimmed ripple, fired silence, judged re-attack, measured. 6 kills followed in 12 days, and the lesson did not depend on theater or flag. It was a proof of principle written in oil stains and the absence of argument. Admirals read it, nodded once, and made it doctrine without ceremony. The ships did not need celebration. They needed the next bearing. On the American coast, a final coastal hunt supplied a coda that sounded like inevitability. A torpedoed merchantman gave a fixed point. Aircraft and escorts laced approaches over it like threads drawn through canvas. Charges still had their place in the theater of belief. There is comfort in noise, but the kills that closed the book were forward measured and singular. Divers would later call the wrecks by their proper names. On the day itself, they were just what happened when process outgrew drama. No one on those bridges thought they were witnessing a turning point. They thought they were doing the job the way the weapon demanded it be done. The radio discipline told its own story. Once the ether before an attack was a chorus of nerves ships stepping on each other's sentences as they tried to be brave. Now, it was a metronome. You hold contact. A breath. Baker prepare to fire. Silence. A ripple. Then either more silence, which meant work, or one thick note that meant the conversation was over. The quiet was not an affectation. It was the last gift the system offered, the ability to hear the truth you had earned. Even the men who had ordered the hunt finally put it into words that would outlive them. In memoirs dictated after the maps were folded and the boats were scrap, one line carries the weight of both pride and concession. We had lost the Battle of the Atlantic. It is not a sentence about one device. It is a sentence about consequences. But the escorts who stood on winter decks, fingers split, and raw over squat shells, knew which piece of iron had turned the last 10 seconds from a gamble into a craft. They knew why the ocean had started answering in binary. Then they realized that the change reached deeper than tactic or theater. It touched culture. The roar had once been proof that men were doing something. Now proof was a single note and a smudge of oil. The vanity of noise gave way to the discipline of contact. The crews went off watch, tired but less hollowed out by ritual. The ships burned less fuel, deafened fewer ears, and wrote fewer lies in their logs. The enemy adapted, as enemies do, turn earlier, change depth, sooner live at the margins of detection, but the center of the engagement had shifted beyond habit. The escorts owned the approach, the sight, and the strike. The hunted owned only the hope that the thread would break. It did not often enough to matter. So the inflection slid into history without an exclamation mark. A handful of spring weeks on one ocean, a fortnight of relentless precision on another, and a last hard hunt off a familiar coast. A device that looked like a crate of plumbing had stolen the blind moment, and with it the myth that thunder equals truth. In its place stood a bow, a wire that kept singing, and a ring of small promises that either found steel or said nothing at all. They did not build monuments to it. The Hedgehog's legacy lived instead in checklists, in the quiet pride of crews who could reload in sleet without fumbling, in the way escorts approached a contact as if walking into a chapel. The principle outlived the crate. Squid took the forward throw deeper and harder, 3 barrels that spoke in a single chord. Limbo refined the language further. Rockets and homing weapons translated the same grammar into new alphabets. Keep contact. Fire forward. Let silence mean miss. Long after the last U-boat lay cold, ships drilled that cadence until it felt older than the war that made it. Ashore, the record kept its modest tone. A museum placard beside a preserved mount gives only dimensions and dates. A training film rescued from a can explains pattern shape with the patience of a schoolteacher. Yet men who had stood on winter decks and felt the single thump come up through the soles of their boots carried something more private. The device had not made them braver. It had made their courage count. They remembered how much fuel they saved when they stopped lunging the last 100 yards, how many ears they spared by not deafening themselves for the comfort of noise, how a convoy master slept the first unbroken hour of a week because escorts now converted threads into closures without drama. The enemy remembered too. In brittle post-war interviews, a few skippers spoke of the small betrayal at the end, the moment the bow cone ceased to be a sanctuary and became a snare. They spoke without bitterness, only with the engineer's respect for an answer that fits the problem. The ocean is the fairest judge in war. It does not care who asks the right question, only that the question is right. Forward throw asked the last question correctly. Careers were shaped by that understanding. Young officers who learned to trust their wire rather than their nerves became the post-war's quiet professionals, the ones who could stand a bridge watch through 3 green nights and never once let vanity talk over information. Sonar schools kept the old headsets and the old waxed plotting sheets, because nothing teaches like a thin bearing line that steadies when the world wants to sway. Even air arms absorbed the lesson-shaping attacks that preserved the last sight of a target rather than riding over it with spectacle. Somewhere off Block Island, the tide still pulls through wreckage, and somewhere in the Pacific, a marker lists a small destroyer escort's improbable run across 12 days. The names weather, the arithmetic does not. A ring of small charges thrown in front of a ship changed the shape of a century's most relentless campaign and taught fleets to trade applause for proof. That is not romance. It is the mature end of courage, the willingness to be untheatrical when the ocean demands it. The rain returns because it always does in these stories, needling the bridge, glass beating on paint, making the deck a dark mirror where men see their breath. A bearing steadies. A captain lifts a hand and no one speaks. 24 squat promises leap ahead and disappear into black water that keeps its counsel. There is either nothing, which means work, or there is the single heavy note that is both verdict and mercy. Back on a watch where this all began, May 1943. North Atlantic, the surface learned to kill in silence. In the years after, it learned something harder and kinder, to let silence tell the truth.